Kandara Station wasn't what I expected from a diplomatic posting. They told me when I signed the liaison corps papers that I'd be stationed at one of the transitional cultural exchange hubs, which sounded, on paper, like something impressive, something important, something that mattered in the slow, grinding machinery of humanity's integration into galactic society. What they didn't tell me was that Kandara Station was essentially a truck stop, or the closest thing to a truck stop that existed at the edge of the Denaris Corridor, a stretch of navigable space where 6 different species trade routes overlapped in a messy, constantly renegotiated tangle of tariffs and rights and resource agreements. Kandara was the physical manifestation of that mess. A station built in stages by at least 4 different contractor species over 80 years, each one adding their section without particularly caring whether it connected elegantly to the previous one. You walked through Kandara, and you could literally feel the architecture arguing with itself. Vaulted Marathi ceilings that didn't line up with the Grathian corridor floors. Gravity plates that shifted calibration every 300 meters because the Teskali section ran .8 standard, and the human section ran 1 full, and the transition zones in between had this quality where your stomach just quietly protested for about 30 seconds and then gave up. There were 12,000 people on Kandara at any given time, maybe a third of them human. The rest spread across what the official station manifest called 17 registered sapient species, which I always thought undersold it, because there were also 6 species present that weren't officially registered yet, 3 of them in ongoing contact negotiation, and one of them, the tall gray ones with the moth wing secondary appendages, that as far as I could tell just showed up one day and nobody had the energy to ask them to leave. My job, technically, was human cultural liaison, which in practice meant I was the person you called when a human crew member got into a misunderstanding with another species, or when the quarterly cultural exchange program needed someone to organize it, or when some researcher from the Galactic Anthropological Survey wanted a human perspective on a sociological study. It was administrative work, mostly. It was important in the way that a lot of invisible until it breaks down things are important. I had an office the size of a generous closet on level 4, a coworker named Petra who handled the translation filing and was deeply, almost philosophically uninterested in drama of any kind, and a view out my 1 porthole-style window that looked directly into the external ductwork of the Marathi commercial block. I had been there 8 months when I met Sulara. The day I met her, Kandara's weather system was malfunctioning. I should explain that. Kandara had an internal atmospheric regulation system. Most large stations did, and the larger and more organically built the station, the more elaborate the system had to be, because you were trying to maintain comfortable conditions for beings with wildly different native atmospheres, filtration needs, and temperature tolerances. The way they solved it on Kandara was through a kind of zoned microclimate approach, where each section of the station maintained its own conditions, and the transition corridors were compromised zones with adjustable parameters. The system had a failure point. It wasn't dramatic, no alarms, no emergency alerts. Just a pressure differential in the atmospheric cycling that caused the moisture recovery units in the level 6 open market district to overcycle, which meant that in a 300-meter stretch of open ceiling commerce hall, it had been raining. Lightly, persistently, and apparently for about 6 hours before someone noticed and logged a maintenance ticket. I was passing through level 6 because the short route between my office and the human district mess hall cut through the open market, and I had discovered early in my posting that the Marathi vendors in the market sold something called karada paste that, when spread on a flatbread equivalent, tasted close enough to a good spicy hummus that I'd made it a semi-daily ritual. I was thinking about karada paste when I walked into the rain, and stopped, because standing in the middle of it, head tilted back, eyes closed, arms slightly extended at her sides, was a girl. She was Vraxi. I knew that much immediately. I'd had 3 months of species briefings before my posting, and the Vraxi were one of the species I'd actually paid attention to, because they were one of the more recently integrated cultures, and there were specific diplomatic protocols around cultural sensitivity with newly integrated species that I was supposed to know. The briefings had included physical description. The double irises, one silver and one whatever their secondary color was, it varied individually. The bioluminescent striping that ran along their collarbones and down the outer sides of their arms, light reactive, shifting subtly with emotional state. The silver hair, that particular quality of it that wasn't quite like human hair, finer, and it moved a little differently, like it had slightly more static charge than physics really warranted. The briefings had described all of this. They had not adequately prepared me for what it looked like in person, with small drops of recycled station moisture falling through the artificial lighting, catching the light and her bioluminescence both, and the station's ambient hum underneath everything, and her standing there like she was the only person in any room who had ever known exactly what to do with a moment. I stood there for probably 4 full seconds, which is a long time to stand still in a public corridor, before she opened her eyes. Both sets of irises, the silver ones and the pale violet ones, layered concentrically, and both of them looking directly at me with an expression that was, I want to be careful here, because I was still learning to read Vraxi facial expressions, and they don't map one-to-one onto human ones, but the closest human translation would be amused, unsurprised, and slightly curious about what I was going to do next. Human, she said, through her own translator chip. She had one already, which meant she'd been around galactic common environments long enough to bother with one. You have been standing very still for a significant moment. It's raining, I said, which was, in retrospect, not my most impressive conversational opening. Yes, she agreed, I noticed. Inside. I noticed that too. She lowered her arms, tilted her head slightly. The bioluminescent striping along her collarbone pulsed once, gently. I'd later learn that was the Vraxi equivalent of a suppressed smile. It is unusual. It's a malfunction. I know, she said. I filed the maintenance report 2 hours ago. But while I was waiting, I thought, she paused, and something in her expression shifted into something softer. I have never felt rain before. My world does not have it. We have mist and we have storms that come with electrical discharge, but not this. She held one hand out, palm up, and watched a droplet land on her skin. This is very small, very gentle. I wanted to feel it for a while before it was fixed. And that was it. That was the whole moment. That was the thing that I've been trying to explain to people ever since when they ask me how it started, because there's no dramatic answer. There's no destiny-shaped answer. There was just a girl from a world without rain standing in someone else's weather, choosing to feel it instead of just report it, and looking at me like she already knew I was going to understand why. I walked out of the dry corridor into the rain and stood next to her. You know, I said, on Earth, rain is so normal we complain about it. She turned those 4-iris eyes on me and looked genuinely astounded. You have a whole planet of this. Most of it, yeah. A long pause, another droplet on her palm. That, she said quietly, sounds like extraordinary wealth. I didn't know what to say to that. So I just stood there with her in the malfunctioning rain, until the maintenance team showed up 20 minutes later and fixed the atmospheric recycler and the light drizzle stopped, and we were both standing in a suddenly dry corridor in the level 6 open market, slightly damp, looking at each other. I'm Dax, I said. Sulara, she said. Do you want to get something to eat? The Marathi vendor 3 stalls down has this paste that. Yes, she said before I finished. I want to hear about rain. Chapter 3, The Build. The next 6 weeks were the best 6 weeks I'd had since landing in the Denaris corridor. That's not a complicated statement. I wasn't unhappy before. The work was fine, the posting was manageable, I had a decent enough routine. But decent enough routine and the best 6 weeks since landing are two different scales, and I know which one Sulara was responsible for. We ate together most days. Not every day. She had her own work and I had mine. She was a junior researcher attached to the Vraxi Cultural Observation Team, which was on Kandara to document cross-species behavioral patterns in a neutral contact environment, which meant, in practice, that she spent a lot of time watching things and writing notes about them, which suited her perfectly because she was one of those people who was naturally, effortlessly observant. She noticed things that I would have walked past 100 times without registering. The way the Teskali traders in the market always faced a particular directional marker when they made a transaction, some holdover navigational ritual from their nomadic period. The way the station's gravity fluctuations in the transition zones made the Marathi visitors unconsciously widen their stance, ancestral memory of a world with inconsistent ground. The way humans, when surprised, looked upward. She'd asked me once why that was, and I didn't know, and she seemed delighted that I didn't know, like it was the most interesting gap in my self-knowledge. She was curious about Earth in a way that didn't feel performative or academic. She wasn't asking questions because she was supposed to. She was asking because she genuinely wanted to know. About weather, she had a deep, sustained fixation on weather, which, given that her world had electrical storms but not precipitation, made a certain kind of sense. About music, she'd heard recorded human music through the station's cultural exchange archive, but she wanted to know what it felt like live, and I described concerts to her in enough detail that she'd been quiet for almost 2 full minutes afterward, which was rare. About cooking, she couldn't eat most human food. The chemistry wasn't compatible, but she was fascinated by the act of cooking, by the idea of taking raw elements and transforming them through heat and pressure and time into something with flavor and meaning. I was curious about her too, about the Vraxi, about what it was like to come from a world that had electrical storms instead of rain, that measured status by the clarity and range of your bioluminescent patterns, that had a concept of family so expansive it was almost untranslatable. The Vraxi word for family encompassed something closer to all those whose flourishing is bound to yours, which included, as I understood it, people you'd never met but were structurally connected to through obligation networks that spanned generations. I was learning, we were both learning, it was good. And then, about 3 weeks into our regular meals, she said something that I didn't quite clock in the moment, but that I thought about later. We were sitting in the human district mess. She developed a tolerance for the ambient food smells, which for her were strange, and I'd gotten better at not ordering the things that were most offensive to Vraxi olfactory sensitivity. And I just finished telling her about my family back in Cascadia province, my mother's garden, the particular quality of Pacific Northwest light in autumn, and she'd listened with that complete attention she gave things. And then she said, "You speak of your home as something whole that you carry with you." "I guess I do," I said. "The Vraxi do not do this," she said. "Home is not something you carry. It is something you return to or you do not. If you do not return, you find new belonging." "Is that lonely?" I asked. "When you're out here?" She considered. The luminescence along her collarbone did something subtle and rippling. "I have my bonding circle," she said. "My sisters." "Your sisters are on Kandara." "2 of them, yes, they are also on the observation team." A pause. "They know about you." I held my flatbread. "Oh. I have told them about the human who stood in the broken rain," she said, and her double irises caught the mess hall's neutral light and did something complex. "They wanted to meet you. I told them not yet." "Why not yet?" She looked at me levelly. "Because I am still deciding." "Deciding what?" Another pause, longer this time. The luminescent stripe on her left arm pulsed twice, a pattern I hadn't seen before. Whether you are what I think you might be, she said carefully. For us, for the circle. I didn't push. I'd learned early on that pushing Sulara for information she wasn't ready to share was not just futile but counterproductive. She had a quality of stillness that could outlast any human impatience by a significant margin. So I let it go. But I thought about it. Whether you are what I think you might be, for us, for the circle. Human relationship psychology, human dating, human attraction, human romantic interest. I knew how those mechanics worked. Or I thought I did. And what was developing between Sulara and me felt, to me, like something that mapped onto those mechanics. Something was there. I wasn't imagining it. The four irises, the bioluminescent pulses I was slowly learning to read. The way she turned toward me in conversation. All of it said something I recognized even if I couldn't read every detail. But for us, and for the circle, that was a frame I didn't have a template for, and I should have asked. I should have pushed a little or asked Petra to pull the cultural files on Vraxi bonding customs, or done literally anything proactive to understand what she was actually saying. I didn't, because I was, not to put too fine a point on it, too busy enjoying the current thing to worry about what the current thing might be building toward. And 3 weeks after that conversation, I met her sisters. Chapter 4, First Contact, the Complicated Kind. Her sisters were named Mariva and Tasha. I mention the names first because the moment I met them, all of it, has this quality in my memory of being simultaneously very ordinary and very much a moment where, had I understood what I was in, I would have sat down carefully and taken several deep breaths. Instead, I shook their hands, or tried to. Vraxi don't have an equivalent handshake. Their greeting gesture involves a brief contact of the back of the wrist to the back of the wrist, an acknowledgement of visible pulse, an expression of mutual aliveness. I'd read about this but defaulted to human reflex anyway, and Mariva, who was the older of the two, taller than Sulara with bioluminescent striping that ran in gold rather than violet, caught my outstretched hand, looked at it, turned it over, and inspected it with the calm thoroughness of someone cataloging an artifact. These are the flat-palmed hands she told us about, Mariva said. Not to me, to Sulara. Yes, said Sulara. He is approximately as described. I tried to be accurate. His coloring is different from the pictures, said Tasha, who was younger, shorter, with striping in pale green that was currently doing something active and flickering. The archive images make humans look more uniform. We vary, I said. All three of them looked at me with an expression I was beginning to recognize as the Vraxi version of mild surprise, a subtle brightening of the secondary iris, a slight tension in the bioluminescent pattern, as if they hadn't expected me to contribute to what had seemed like a conversation about me. He speaks directly, said Tasha, with something that I would later identify as approval. He does, said Sulara, and there was something in how she said it, a quality of quiet satisfaction, the way you feel when something you said about someone turns out to be accurate. We ate together. The four of us, at a table in the level 3 neutral zone, a cafe-style space that the station had specifically designed for cross-species socialization, meaning the menu could accommodate 12 different dietary profiles simultaneously, and the ambient lighting was calibrated for overlapping visual comfort ranges. It was strange and comfortable and warm in a way I hadn't expected. Mariva was formal, precise, occasionally funny in a very dry way that snuck up on you. Tasha was openly curious and asked questions with a directness that would have been rude by human social standards, but among the Vraxi seemed to be considered considerate, the idea being that asking directly respected someone's intelligence more than hinting did. She asked me things like how I determined social hierarchy among humans, whether I experienced time differently at night versus during the station's simulated day cycle, and whether I had ever felt that my species' single-orbit homeworld had given humans a different relationship to the concept of permanence. That last one I thought about for a long time. Maybe, I said, we have one sun, one moon. The cycles are simple, so we maybe expect things to be more permanent than they are. Tasha's luminescent pattern went bright. That is a very clear observation for someone not trained in observational work. He has been learning to pay attention, Sulara said. From you, said Mariva. Sulara's collarbone striping pulsed in that pattern I'd started to recognize as amusement. Somewhat mutually. After the meal, we walked together through the level 3 commercial corridor, and it was easy, genuinely easy, in the way that easy things sometimes surprise you. They asked about Earth with the same sustained, genuine interest that Sulara had. Mariva was particularly fixated on the concept of seasons, which the Vraxi homeworld didn't have. Their world's axial tilt was minimal, giving them a climate that varied by region rather than by time of year. The idea that the same place could transform completely based on where the planet was in its orbit, that the same trees went from green to gold to bare and back again, this seemed to strike her as something close to miraculous. The same place, she said carefully, but different. Every year, I said. Same trees, same hills, different. That is a very long form of transformation, she said. It is, I agreed. And Tasha said, quietly, walking on my other side, Sulara said you stood in the rain and understood why she wanted to feel it. I tried to. She said you didn't explain it, you just came and stood with her. There wasn't anything to explain. Tasha made a sound that the translator chip rendered as approximately, but which I could hear had a musical quality underneath it, a tonal shift that I knew was significant but didn't yet have a reference for. We parted ways at the junction where the level 3 corridor split toward the research module. They went one way, I went the other. And just before Sulara turned to go, she looked back at me and said, Come to the observation deck tomorrow, 7th watch, bring nothing, just come. Okay, I said. I went home and pulled every cultural file I had access to on Vraxi bonding customs. I read until the station's simulated night was most of the way through. And then I sat with what I'd read in my small closet office in the quiet of deep station night, and I thought, Oh, that's what she meant by for us, for the circle. Chapter 5, The Weight of What I Didn't Know. I need to explain something about the Vraxi before I go further, because otherwise none of what comes next makes any sense. The Vraxi, their world is called Vraxa Minor, in the translation we use for it, though their own name for it doesn't have a direct transliteration, are a species with a deeply communal structure of intimate bonding. They don't, not historically, not culturally, not as a default, form what humans would call a dyadic pair bond. One-on-one, two people, just us against the world, that's a human framework, and it's one that the cultural documentation I read that night was careful to describe as species-specific and not universal. The Vraxi form what they call a soratha. The translator chip renders it as bonding circle in English, though the actual concept is closer to a woven relational structure. A soratha typically consists of a central bonded partner, the daruva, the anchor, and two or more sural bonded companions who are equally part of the structure but fill different complementary roles within it. All bonds in a soratha are considered full and real, not arranged in hierarchy, not in competition. The circle is an entity unto itself. Not all Vraxi form a soratha. Pair bonds exist and are considered valid, but the soratha is the traditional structure, the one written into law and cultural ceremony, the one that carries the full weight of their bonding customs. And the soratha most commonly, not always, but most commonly forms around sisters. Because among the Vraxi, sisters share a biological phenomenon called lurhavith, a resonance in their bioluminescent systems that runs in families and deepens between siblings. Sisters' luminescent patterns synchronize naturally. They feel each other's major emotional states at close range as a kind of sympathetic glow. And when they form a Soratha together, the person who joins the circle, the Daruva, joins all of them. Not sequentially, not in a ranking. All at once, as a function of the circle. The cultural files were very clear on this point. The Daruva is not chosen by one sister and shared with the others. The Daruva is chosen by the circle. All three must find resonance. All three must choose together. Which meant, and this was the part I sat with for a long time, when Sulara had said, "I am still deciding whether you are what I think you might be for us, for the circle." She wasn't speaking metaphorically. She wasn't being poetic about how her sisters were important to her. She was telling me, in the Vraxi way, which assumed that the listener would understand the cultural context that the listener, in this case me, absolutely did not have. She was telling me that she was evaluating me as a potential Daruva for a three-person Soratha that included her and her two sisters. And when she'd had me meet Marava and Tasha, that had been a stage of the evaluation. And when Tasha had asked me whether I just stood with Sulara in the rain without explaining anything, and had made that musical sound when I said yes, that had been not a casual observation. That had been a check mark, a data point, an indicator that I might be resonant. I sat in my office in the middle of station night and thought about this for a while. I'd like to say I thought about it with great philosophical clarity and arrived at a principled position. What I actually thought in this order was: 1. I had feelings for Sulara, real ones. The kind that had been quietly building for 6 weeks and were not going away and were getting steadily more difficult to pretend, were just professional friendliness. 2. I had, over the course of one dinner and one evening walk, developed a genuine warmth for Marava and Tasha. Not the same thing, differently textured, but real. 3. The thing I'd read about, the Soratha, the bonding circle, the Luravath synchronization, was genuinely beautiful. As a concept, as a structure of relationship. It was nothing like what I'd grown up understanding family and love to look like, and it was beautiful in a way that wasn't diminished by being unfamiliar. 4. None of my cultural training had prepared me for this, not in any concrete way. 5. I did not know what to do. I went asleep eventually. I went to the observation deck at 7th watch. Chapter 6. The Observation Deck. Kandara Station's observation deck was one of the few things about the station that was unambiguously impressive. It was at the topmost point of the central hub, top being a relative direction on a station where orientation was more convention than physics, but the observation dome was positioned so that, when you were standing in it, you felt unmistakably like you were above everything else. The dome was made of ethrin composite, optically perfect, structurally rated for anything the Denaris corridor could throw at it, which, given the local debris field and the occasional navigational miscalculation by incoming traffic, was saying something. On a clear station cycle, meaning when the traffic in the approach lanes was light enough that you weren't looking at the backsides of cargo freighters, you could see deep into the corridor, past the navigational beacons, out to where the stars got dense and bright, and the color of old amber. All three of them were already there when I arrived. Sulara and Marava and Tasha, standing at 3 points of a loose triangle near the center of the dome floor, and the station's simulated night cycle was running, which meant the dome overhead was calibrated to near blackout to maximize observation quality, and the corridor outside was doing what it sometimes did in the deep cycle, running at low traffic. So what I saw through the dome was almost unobstructed deep space. I stopped at the entry, 3 pairs of double irises catching the starlight. "You came," said Sulara. "You said to," I answered. "What are we doing?" Tasha moved aside slightly, making the triangle into a shape that had a natural 4th point, a space that I could step into. "We are showing you something," Marava said, It is a Vraxi practice. We do not have a word that translates simply into what you call common. Try, I said. Marava considered. In your language, the nearest thing might be witnessing together. We look at the same thing at the same time. We let it mean something. It is a form of binding. When you share the experience of looking at something vast, it creates a. She paused, searching, and her gold striping shifted in thought. A common reference in your sense of each other. After this, when you think of the vast thing, you also think of the person who stood with you. I looked at Sulara. She was watching me. Like standing in rain, I said. Her bioluminescence pulsed across her collarbone, bright and warm. I stepped into the fourth point of the triangle. We stood there, the four of us, in the dark of the observation dome, and we looked at the stars. I don't know how long we stood there. Long enough that my eyes adjusted fully and the corridor traffic dropped to near zero, and the only thing outside was the deep, ancient scatter of light. Long enough that I stopped thinking in words and was just present, just in it. And somewhere in that time, Tasha moved until she was standing beside me on my left. And Marava moved until she was standing behind me, just close enough that I could feel the slight warmth of her presence. And Sulara was in front of me, facing the stars, and her hair moved in some circulation current from the dome's atmospheric system, and her luminescent striping was doing something slow and synchronized with both of her sister's patterns. I could see it in my peripheral vision, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in an entirely understated, completely quiet way. And then Tasha said, low and unhurried, "Dax. Yeah. Do you understand what this is?" A long pause. "I read some things last night," I said, "after we met." "What did you read?" "About the Soratha," I said, "about the bonding circle, about sisters and the Lurevith." Nobody said anything for a moment. "And," said Marava from behind me, quiet even. "And I think Sulara has been telling me something for a while that I didn't have the context to understand," I said. "And I think tonight is you three telling me something directly." "We are," said Sulara without turning, "because we decided." "That I tried to find the right word and didn't quite have it." "That you might be our Daruva," said Marava, "if you choose." The stars didn't move. The station hummed. Tasha's pale green luminescence was very still beside me. I said, "I need to tell you that I don't know what this looks like from my side. Where I come from, this isn't humans don't typically." "We know," said Sulara. "I read about human pair bonding. It is very particular. Very," she paused, and I heard something that might have been gentleness in the translator rendering. "Narrow, in a way that is also very deep." "I have feelings for you," I said, "real ones for a while." "I know," she said. "And I spent one evening with Marava and Tasha, and I." "We know," said Tasha. "I don't know what to call what that is." "You don't need to call it anything yet," said Marava. "That is not how this begins. It does not begin with naming. It begins with choosing to look at the same thing." I stood there for another long moment. "What happens next?" I said. "If I choose this, if I say yes?" "Then you meet the circle fully," said Sulara. "Then we begin." "That's a lot," I said. "Yes," said all three of them, at almost the same moment, with an unself-conscious synchrony that made the hairs on my arms stand up in the best possible way. I looked out at the stars for a while. And then I said, "Okay." Chapter 7, THE Incident. Okay, so here is where I have to be clear about timeline. The observation deck night was the beginning. It was not the resolution. Between that night and the situation I'm now sitting in the debrief room trying to explain, there were approximately 3 weeks of what I can only call the most complicated and also most meaningful period of my entire time in the Denaris corridor. 3 weeks of figuring out what this was, what it meant in practice, how it worked. The Soratha does not unfold all at once. I want to be clear about this because I think there's a human tendency, certainly a tendency I had to hear bonding circle with three sisters and immediately try to map it onto some kind of human social framework, some template that already exists. There isn't a good template. The Soratha is its own thing, and it unfolds in its own way, which is more like a trust structure building, one layer at a time. What it meant in those 3 weeks was, I spent time with each of them separately, and with all three of them together, and we talked about everything, about nothing, about their research and my work and their world and mine. Marava taught me the Vraxi system of emotional notation, which used bioluminescent pattern variations to communicate states too subtle for language. She said humans approximated this with facial expressions, and I said yes, but they were a lot harder to read from the outside, and she said dryly, "This explains much about human misunderstanding." Tasha and I spent an afternoon in the station archive, pulling Earth weather documentation, and she cataloged cloud types with a focus that bordered on reverent. She had a theory, which I thought was genuinely interesting, that cultures without precipitation developed a different relationship to abundance, one where abundance was something you built or claimed rather than something that simply fell on you from above. Your species, she said, are very comfortable with the idea of receiving gifts from the sky. I thought about that for a long time. And Sulara and I had a conversation one night in the Neutral Zone Cafe that we'd made sort of an unofficial regular spot that I keep coming back to in my memory because of how simple it was. She asked me if I was afraid. I said yes. She asked of what specifically. I said of getting this wrong, of misunderstanding something important and hurting all three of you, of not knowing enough about who you are and what you need. She was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Dax, you stood in the rain because I wanted to feel it. That is already knowing something important." 3 weeks of that. And then Commander Veth Nakari arrived at Kandara Station on a Vraxi military science vessel with a diplomatic retinue, and the nature of my life got abruptly and significantly more complex. Chapter 8, Commander Nakari. Commander Nakari was everything the Vraxi cultural files had described as high status. His bioluminescent patterns were exceptional. The files noted that Vraxi of significant military standing often had extensive, precise patterning developed through rigorous biometric discipline, essentially a trained aesthetic that signaled both genetic quality and dedicated cultivation. Nakari's ran in deep copper and bronze across his shoulders and down his arms in formal military notation, which I'd learned by that point to read as rank, record, and intention, all stated simultaneously. He arrived at Kandara as part of an official Vraxi military liaison mission. There were ongoing negotiations about Vraxi territorial rights in the outer Denaris corridor, and Kandara was the agreed meeting point, which was standard, which was fine, which was my job to facilitate, actually. Part of what the Liaison Corps did was smooth the logistics for exactly these kinds of visiting delegations, and I'd been briefed on the Vraxi military mission a week in advance, and had spent time preparing meeting room configurations and atmospheric calibrations and dietary accommodation lists. I had not been briefed on the fact that Commander Nakari knew Sulara's family, or that, by traditional Vraxi social custom, he had what the files, when I frantically pulled them, described as a standing suitorship claim, which was a complex and apparently very real concept in Vraxi culture, involving a formal declaration of intent made by someone of sufficiently high status, which gave them a social right to be considered as a bonding candidate before the circle fully formed. In other words, Commander Nakari had, at some point in the past, declared intent toward the Sulara bonding circle, and that declaration had not been formally withdrawn. And he knew I was here. The first time I encountered him directly, it was in the corridor outside the Level 2 meeting suite, 2 days after his arrival. I was walking with Sulara and Tasha, coming back from a planning meeting for the quarterly exchange event I was organizing. He came around a junction corner with 2 members of his retinue, stopped when he saw us, and looked at me with an expression that I did not need a Vraxi facial expression guide to read. It was the same expression in any species. "You are in something that concerns me." "Sulara," he said, in what I assumed was Vraxi before the translator chip caught up, "you did not indicate you were in open Soratha evaluation." "I am not required to indicate this to a standing claimant," she said. Her voice was very even. "The claim has not been accepted. There is no obligation." His bioluminescent patterns shifted, copper going toward something darker, and not in a subtle way. The standing claim creates a courteous expectation. "The standing claim," said Tasha, "is 12 years old and has never been formally acknowledged by the circle." The copper went darker. I stood there between them and slightly back, because this was, honestly, from a diplomatic liaison standpoint, this was not my conversation to wade into. This was a Vraxi interpersonal matter that was happening inside a Vraxi cultural framework I was still learning. My instinct was to stay quiet, assess, not be the thing that escalated this. Nakari's eyes shifted to me, both sets of irises assessing. "This is the human," he said. "This is Dax," said Sulara. "He is known to our circle." "Known to the circle," Nakari repeated, something careful in his tone, "and the circle considers him a candidate." "We consider him many things," said Sulara. "This is not a matter for a standing claimant." A long pause, the corridor's ambient hum, 2 retinue members standing very still. Then Nakari turned his eyes fully onto me and said, in translatorship common, very deliberately, "Human, you understand what you are entering into. The Soratha of the Sulara circle is not a simple matter. There are obligations. There are cultural standards. There are ways in which an outsider, a well-meaning outsider, can fail a circle without intending to." It was smooth. I'll give him that. It was not a threat. It was framed as concern. But the implication was clear. You are not equipped for this. I looked at him, measured my response. "Commander," I said, "I appreciate the concern. I'm doing my best to understand the obligations and the cultural standards, and I take them seriously. If there's something specific you think I should know, I'm open to hearing it." "A beat." "That," he said carefully, "is either confidence or naivety." "Could be both," I said. "I'm still new here." Tasha made a sound beside me, the same musical hum sound she'd made when I told her I just stood with Sulara in the rain, a tone I now knew to read as, "This is someone who is paying attention." Nakari looked at her. Something shifted in his pattern, less certain now, more reading. "We will speak again, human," he said. "Sure," I said. He walked past. His retinue followed. The corridor went back to its normal ambient hum. Tasha waited until they were around the corner and then said, quietly, "You did not defer." Was I supposed to? A standing claimant of his rank expects deference from a declared competitor. It is a way of establishing precedence. "I don't really do precedence by expectation," I said. Another pause. Then Tasha said to Sulara, without looking away from the direction Nakari had gone, "He definitely does not defer." And Sulara said, with the particular quality in her voice that I had learned to listen for, "No, he does not." Petra, my coworker, sat across from me in our shared office the morning after the corridor encounter, and looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has heard a thing, and is processing whether it is their problem. "The Vraxi military commander," she said. "He has a standing suitorship claim on the bonding circle," I said. "On your bonding circle?" "It's not officially my bonding circle yet. We're in evaluation." "Right," she turned back to her terminal, "Dax." "Yeah." "You are aware that a Vraxi standing claim, if the claimant escalates it formally, becomes a diplomatic matter." I had not known this. I knew it now from the look on her face. Meaning, she said carefully, that if Commander Nakari decides to push the standing claim through official channels, it doesn't just become a personal matter between you and him. It becomes something the station administration has to handle, and the station administration in those cases defers to Vraxi cultural law. She paused. Because Kandara is in the Denaris corridor, which falls under joint Vraxi-Marathi administrative oversight. So Vraxi cultural law would govern how the claim gets resolved. Under Vraxi cultural law, she said, a standing claim at his rank has priority rights in a Soratha evaluation, meaning if he formally asserts the claim, the circle would be, technically, legally, obligated to make a formal consideration of him first. I sat with that. Can they reject it? The circle can reject any claim, Petra said, but the formal process requires them to submit the rejection through the Vraxi Cultural Registry with documentation. It takes, she checked something, 14 to 20 standard days for the registry to process. And during that time, the evaluation with any other candidate is considered suspended. I stared at the ductwork outside my porthole for a while. He knows this, I said. Almost certainly. He's going to file formally. Petra turned back to her terminal in the way of someone who had decided this was, after all, not their problem but was willing to wish me well from a distance. That would be my assumption. I thanked her, which she acknowledged with a small nod, and went to find Sulera.